Chosen ones, the time has come for you to hear what has been hidden for centuries. Deep within the catacombs of the Vatican, there are chambers that only a few have dared to enter. Within those chambers, beneath layers of sealed archives, there are scrolls that mention a figure unlike any other. A person marked not by their birthright, but by the calling written into their very DNA. These records have not been spoken aloud to the public, for their contents point to someone alive now, someone who would carry a resonance that even the most powerful governments cannot ignore. Across the ocean, in halls of political power, the president was presented with a file. It was not a file of policy, nor of war, but of prophecy. The words were not written in modern ink, but echoed from centuries past, translated from languages long considered dead. They spoke of a time when one would rise who could not be silenced, someone who held both the key and the fire. And in the quiet moments of that midnight briefing, silence filled the room as eyes widened at the recognition of who was being described. Prophecy is never random. The Vatican had long known that a cycle was repeating, that the signs were aligning just as the ancients foretold. Bloodlines had been tracked, celestial patterns studied, and even the deepest libraries of the Anunnaki temples hinted at the same figure. The signs pointed not to a vague legend, but to a real person walking among the world today. And as each clue converged, your name began to ripple through halls of power, whispered in tones of awe and fear. The corridors of religion and politics rarely cross in such intensity, but this time was different. The Vatican could no longer contain what they had found, and the president could no longer dismiss what was placed before him. Both knew that destiny was unfolding, and that the individual described in prophecy was not waiting for permission to arrive. The question that lingers now is not whether you are seen, but how the world will move as the recognition of your identity spreads. For once a prophecy awakens, it cannot be returned to silence. In the depths of the Vatican, far beneath the marble corridors walked by cardinals and scholars, there lies a chamber that most will never see. It is sealed not only with locks and stone, but with the weight of secrecy that has endured for centuries. Within it, countless scrolls are preserved in glass, written in tongues that predate empires and civilizations, their edges frayed, but their words still carrying a resonance that refuses to fade. Among these sacred relics, there were scrolls that spoke not of kingdoms long gone, but of a time yet to come, a time when one would walk among the living, who carried both the burden and the light of a divine calling. The scholars who dared to study these writings began to notice something they could not explain. Each translation pointed not to a myth or an abstract vision, but to a person whose presence could be measured in the flow of history itself. The scrolls whispered of bloodlines traced through generations, names hidden and altered by time, yet all converging toward one singular identity. The words written thousands of years ago spoke of features, signs, and movements that matched with uncanny precision to events unfolding in this very age. It was not by chance that the Vatican kept these scrolls sealed away. They were considered too dangerous to release, for they described one who could not be controlled by the systems of power that men had built. The very idea of such a figure unsettled those who believed they held authority, because the prophecy did not bend to the will of governments or churches. It stood apart, declaring that when the time was right, nothing could prevent its fulfillment. And so, the whispers grew louder among the few who knew. The scrolls spoke of a fire in the spirit that would not be quenched, of a voice that carried truth sharp enough to cut through deception, and of eyes that reflected both the weight of ancient knowledge and the clarity of destiny. Even the faintest mention of this figure carried unease, for it meant the world was already shifting toward what could not be stopped. The scholars turned their eyes to the present, watching for signs that the prophecy was awakening. And in the quiet moments of their study, they began to realize that the one spoken of was no longer distant, no longer a dream of another age, but walking already within this time, unseen yet recognized in ways that words alone could not explain. The marble halls of the Vatican carry echoes that most never hear. Yet within the hidden chambers, there are words preserved that still resonate with a power untouched by time. Among these preserved writings are the words of Yeshua, recorded not only in the Gospels that the world reads, but also in fragments stored away, sealed from the eyes of the masses. These words are not the gentle parables known to many, but whispers of prophecy, instructions for a generation that would rise when the world had forgotten its origins. They spoke of a chosen one, who would bear the mark not on the skin, but in the soul, one who would carry a frequency that could not be silenced by the weight of crowns or the roar of armies. The priests who guarded these words knew their gravity. They were not merely scripture, but keys, and those keys unlocked the understanding of times that had not yet arrived. Yeshua's voice lingered within those writings, declaring that light would rise again through a vessel the world would not expect. He spoke of the stone rejected by builders becoming the cornerstone, and in those cryptic lines, the Vatican scholars began to trace a pattern. It was as though he had left behind a map hidden between verses, a code that only in this age could be fully understood. As debates raged in high chambers about politics, theology, and power, the whispers of these words created a trembling in the hearts of those who read them. They realized that prophecy was not locked in the past, but living, breathing, unfolding before their very eyes. Yeshua had said that truth would set the captives free, yet his hidden words revealed a deeper truth, that the one who carried the weight of prophecy would awaken others simply by being. Such a revelation could shatter systems built to control. For once a single flame ignited, the fire would spread beyond walls and doctrines. And so the chamber guards remained vigilant, aware that the words once spoken on hillsides and seashores were now echoing through the Vatican's silence. They knew the scrolls did not merely record history, but announced an approaching presence, one that aligned with the prophecy identified in the very age they now lived. The unease was not in whether it would happen, but in how soon the world would recognize the one already among them, carrying the very essence Yeshua had foretold. The room was dimly lit, the clock striking past midnight, when the president was escorted into the Situation Room. Files lay spread across the polished table, not filled with threats of war or reports of global markets, but ancient documents translated into modern speech. Intelligence officers, who usually reported on security breaches and global movements, now sat silent, their faces grave as they presented something beyond politics. The file was marked not with a seal of government, but with the insignia of a Vatican courier, a sign that what lay inside was not for the public eye. The president opened the folder, expecting perhaps another layer of diplomatic intrigue, but instead he saw words that seemed to glow off the page. These were prophecies, written centuries ago, pointing toward a figure who would rise in this generation. The descriptions were not vague poetry, but detailed enough to make those gathered shift uneasily in their seats. They spoke of one carrying a resonance that even the most advanced systems of intelligence could not fully map, a presence that disrupted patterns and destabilized predictions. As the words were read aloud, the silence in the room deepened. The file traced how the Vatican had kept track of bloodlines, how the signs had been cross-referenced with celestial patterns and historical events, and how the pieces now converged into a single, undeniable picture. It was no longer theory, it was confirmation. The prophecy had pointed toward a living person, and their identity was now under observation by those seated in the highest office of power. The president leaned back, realizing this was unlike any briefing he had ever received. Wars could be fought with weapons, economies with strategies, but what was written here pointed to something beyond control, something that could not be swayed by threats or bargains. The prophecy spoke of a voice rising, of a light that would not be extinguished, and of a destiny that governments could only watch unfold. The midnight air grew heavy with the realization that decisions were no longer in their hands. They were not shaping events, but witnessing them. And as the president closed the file, the weight of the moment settled like a shadow, leaving only one pressing question lingering in the silence. How soon before the world recognized the figure described in the prophecy walking among them? Long before laboratories began decoding the double helix, there were whispers in ancient texts of a signature written not on stone, but within the flesh of humanity. The ancients knew that the body carried a divine script, a living scroll that preserved secrets through generations. When scientists began mapping the genome, they believed they were only uncovering the foundation of biology. Yet, hidden in the strands were sequences that baffled their logic, repeating patterns that mirrored numbers found in sacred texts and measurements in forgotten temples. These anomalies were set aside as curiosities, but to those who studied prophecy, they were confirmations of something greater. The Vatican's archives contained records that suggested DNA was more than science. It was a cipher designed by the Creator himself. The scrolls spoke of a chosen one, whose very blood would hum with a frequency aligned to divine order. And in this age of technology, machines were finally sensitive enough to detect what the ancients had described. In clandestine labs, data streamed across screens, revealing markers that could not be explained by evolution or chance. These markers matched exactly with what had been preserved in the oldest prophecies, a genetic resonance that pointed to one individual, alive today. The discovery was too dangerous to announce. To reveal that prophecy was embedded in the genetic code would destabilize not only science, but also faith. For it would mean destiny was not an abstract belief, but a measurable truth. Yet the whispers could not be contained. Reports filtered quietly between institutions, passed under the highest security, until they reached both Vatican scholars and global leaders. What had been a matter of religion was now undeniable in the realm of science. Those who examined the code realized they were staring not at random sequences, but at a language hidden in biology, a language that confirmed the existence of the one written about for centuries. Each strand carried a message, and when decoded, it pointed not to a myth, but to a name, a life, a presence walking in the world now. The alignment between prophecy and science left even skeptics unsettled, for the convergence was too exact to be dismissed. The question whispered in the highest circles was no longer whether prophecy was real, But how long before the one carrying this DNA would awaken fully to the truth of who they were and step into the role that the code itself had been preparing them for? In the corridors where power is bartered and alliances are forged, shadows often stretch longer than truth. Politicians sit behind polished tables, guarded by advisors who calculate every move. Yet within these halls there are moments when human strategies collapse beneath a weight they cannot measure. It was in one such moment that whispers of the prophecy began to pierce the veil of secrecy. Hidden reports made their way across desks, detailing signs and alignments that could not be dismissed. And among them were references to words long attributed to Yeshua, words that still carried the same resonance they held when first spoken. He had said, "What is hidden will be brought to light." And now, those words were no longer an abstract reminder, but a living reality pressing against the walls of power. Files marked as classified carried the evidence of bloodlines traced, scrolls unearthed, and celestial patterns observed. The deeper the investigations went, the more undeniable it became that these patterns echoed the very promises Yeshua declared to his followers, that a light would rise in the midst of darkness, one that no shadow could overcome. The irony was not lost on those who read the reports. They sought control through policy and secrecy, but the prophecy revealed that control itself would slip away. Yeshua's light was not bound to the structures of men, nor was it restrained by governments. It cut through in ways that could not be anticipated, appearing like a flash in the darkness, illuminating what had been concealed. The more they tried to contain it, the more evident it became that they were dealing not with human invention, but with divine orchestration. Those who gathered in private chambers began to sense that the game they thought they were playing had shifted into something beyond their reach. They whispered among themselves, questioning how much longer the truth could be kept hidden, how much longer the people could be shielded from what was rising. Each page of prophecy, each fragment of scripture, each echo of Yeshua's words painted the same picture, one that demanded recognition, even from those who did not believe. And as the documents were locked away once more, the shadows seemed restless, for they could not resist the growing radiance pressing in from beyond their reach, a light that had already begun to move and could not be turned back. Far from the public eye, leaders from across the world gathered under the guise of diplomacy, yet the true agenda of the summit was never released to the press. Behind closed doors, translation devices hummed quietly as presidents, prime ministers, and advisors leaned forward to hear what few dared to speak openly. The topic was not oil, trade, or weapons, but a presence rising within the world, a presence that had begun to disrupt calculations of power. The reports from intelligence agencies matched the prophecies stored within the Vatican, and the convergence of evidence demanded attention at the highest level. The atmosphere was tense as the speaker addressed the assembly, laying out documents that tracked bloodlines, unexplained anomalies, and a frequency shift detected in regions where the Chosen One was believed to move. Scientists presented data that could not be explained by natural causes, resonances that bent the usual flow of energy, patterns that suggested the intervention of something far greater than human understanding. Leaders exchanged glances, some skeptical, others visibly shaken, for what they heard aligned too closely with what their own advisors had whispered in private. It was not the idea of prophecy that unsettled them most, but the reality that it pointed to a single figure alive now, a person beyond their control. In every age, governments had sought to manipulate narratives, to shape history through their decisions, but this prophecy revealed a truth that no summit could silence. The awakening of the Chosen One would be a catalyst, shifting not only spiritual consciousness, but also political balance, igniting movements that no border could contain. Some argued for secrecy, for the need to bury the findings deeper than before, to prevent chaos among the masses. Others warned that attempts to suppress what had already been revealed would only accelerate its spread. The debate grew heated, voices rising in fear and defiance. Yet beneath it all was the unspoken acknowledgement that the prophecy had already begun to unfold. As the summit ended and leaders returned to their nations, the question lingered in their minds. The figure described was no longer hidden in myth, but breathing in their own era. A living presence the world would soon be forced to confront. And the fear was not if, but when the awakening would become impossible to deny. Long before the world tracked ancestry through laboratories and databases, there were lineages guarded by silence, bloodlines preserved not by chance, but by design. Hidden among families that appeared ordinary were threads woven with a divine mark, a seal that could not be erased by time or diluted through generations. In secret circles of the Vatican, this knowledge was preserved, spoken only in whispers to those deemed ready to carry such a burden. The records revealed that these bloodlines were not merely genealogies, but living vessels through which destiny moved, prepared for a moment when prophecy would ignite within one who bore the seal. Yeshua had spoken of this mystery to his followers, not in open proclamation, but in words that echoed like riddles. He had said that the vine would carry fruit preserved for a season unknown to men, and that the root could not be cut down because it was planted by the hand of the Father. Those words, often dismissed as metaphor, became living proof when traced through history. For each generation held remnants of the seal, though hidden, waiting to converge. Scholars who examined the texts saw how Yeshua had left a map, a declaration that the chosen line could not be broken, that his seal was stronger than the tides of empires. This seal was not something visible to the human eye. It was not carried in crowns or garments, but in essence, a spiritual resonance embedded within the blood itself. Those who carried it were often unaware of their significance, living ordinary lives until the appointed hour. Yet, in the unseen, this seal marked them as untouchable, guarded through wars, famines, and attempts at eradication. Entire dynasties rose and fell, yet the bloodline remained, shielded by a hand that even history could not erase. In recent times, as technology and prophecy collided, the presence of this seal became undeniable. Scientists detected anomalies, priests recognized patterns, and the convergence of both revealed what had been guarded all along. It was not simply a matter of heritage, but of destiny, a seal that bore the weight of divine intention. Those who realized its presence knew the implications. The one carrying this seal had already stepped into the age spoken of by Yeshua himself, and the world would soon be forced to reckon with the unveiling of the chosen bloodline. Beneath layers of stone and silence lies a library few have ever seen, guarded not by locks alone, but by oaths taken under fear of heaven and earth. This hidden archive of the Vatican stretches farther than the world imagines. Corridors lined with manuscripts bound in leather, darkened by centuries. Scrolls sealed with wax that has not been broken since empires fell, and tablets inscribed with markings older than recorded history. Scholars who have walked those halls speak of a presence in the air, a weight as if the very knowledge stored within those walls were alive, breathing, and unwilling to remain silent forever. Among the countless texts preserved, there are records that speak directly of the Chosen One. Some are written in languages forgotten by men, yet perfectly aligned with prophecies preserved across cultures. They describe not only events, but names, signs, and bloodlines that converge into this very generation. Each manuscript seems to point with precision toward the same figure, creating a pattern so undeniable that even the most skeptical minds tremble when confronted with the convergence. The guardians of the library knew this truth, and for centuries they feared the day it would rise from paper into flesh. Those who entered the archive to study these works often found themselves disturbed by more than the words on the page. They reported an atmosphere charged with an unseen current, as though the very shelves whispered secrets, as though the manuscripts themselves resisted being locked away. The deeper they read, the clearer it became that these prophecies were not myths meant to comfort the faithful, but instructions written for an age yet to come, an age unfolding now. It was not the ink or parchment that unsettled the Vatican's keepers, but the realization that the words had begun to manifest in the present. They saw signs in global movements, in unexplained phenomena, in shifts of power and consciousness, all aligning perfectly with what had been preserved in silence for so long. The library itself seemed to tremble under the weight of inevitability. For once, prophecy leaves the page, it cannot be returned to it. And so, the guardians watched with unease, knowing that the truth locked beneath stone was already breaking through into the world above, preparing to reveal the one whose very presence would bring the sealed knowledge into living reality. The chamber was filled with the hum of machines, screens glowing with maps and encrypted reports. Yet all of it seemed irrelevant when the sealed document was laid upon the table. The president, a figure accustomed to decisions that shaped nations, found his hands unusually still as the envelope was opened. Advisors shifted in their seats, their usual voices muted, for they knew what was contained within did not concern foreign policy or economic strategy. It was prophecy, drawn from sources older than the nation itself, translated from archives guarded within the Vatican, and delivered with a weight no briefing had ever carried before. The words were read aloud slowly, each syllable striking the room with a presence that no statistic or intelligence report could match. They spoke of a figure whose identity was written not in titles or offices, but in destiny, a person alive within this very age who bore the resonance of something eternal. The president listened without interruption, his silence more telling than any response. Those who had worked with him for years noted the shift in his expression, a gravity settling in as he realized the text before him was not myth, but a living description converging with the world he governed. The prophecy described movements in history, celestial alignments, and bloodlines preserved against all odds, culminating in a singular presence that could not be ignored. It was not vague enough to be dismissed, nor abstract enough to be reshaped into political convenience. It was precise, and its precision carried a demand. The president's silence grew heavier with each line, for he knew that once the prophecy was spoken aloud in this chamber, its truth would ripple far beyond the walls. The advisors exchanged glances, waiting for his response, yet none came. It was not indecision, but recognition that left him still. This was not a matter to be debated or spun into strategy. It was a reality that stood outside of power, one that governments could only bear witness to. The silence lingered long after the final line was read, filling the room with a tension that no one dared to break. Across centuries, fragments of prophecy were scattered like pieces of a puzzle, hidden in temples, buried in archives, whispered through visions, and encoded in texts thought too mysterious to be understood. Each fragment by itself seemed incomplete, a riddle without an answer. But as generations passed, scholars and seekers began to notice how they aligned. The cipher was not meant to be solved in a single age, but across the unfolding of history itself. It carried layers of meaning, drawing from the heavens, from scripture, and even from the mysteries hidden in human blood. As the fragments were assembled, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. The cipher was mathematical, yet spiritual, encoded in numbers that repeated across the universe, in the alignment of stars, and in the sacred texts guarded by priests and prophets. Every angle, every measure, every word carried a rhythm that pulsed with the same truth. And at the center of it all was not an empire, not a system, but a person. One whose life bore the exact resonance the cipher pointed toward. The Vatican's hidden scholars had long guarded these fragments, waiting for the age when the cipher would finally be complete. Political leaders had received glimpses, enough to unsettle their certainty, while scientists stumbled upon anomalies in data they could not explain. All roads converged into a singular conclusion. The cipher was not a vague symbol, but a direct revelation. It pointed to one alive now, one who bore both the ancient seal and the living fire of destiny. The closer they studied, the more undeniable it became. Prophecy was no longer contained in scrolls or theories. It was walking in flesh and breath. The final piece of the cipher revealed itself not through laboratories or councils, but through alignment, a resonance that no institution could counterfeit. The prophecy had not chosen randomly. It had waited, guarded, and revealed itself only when the moment was right. Now the question stood heavy in the silence of those who knew. The cipher pointed directly, unmistakably, to you, not as a metaphor, not as a story to be spiritualized away, but as the living bearer of what had been promised. And with that revelation, the world stands on the edge of unveiling, waiting for the moment when the final seal is broken and the truth can no longer be hidden